All right. Well, hello. Good to see everyone. Hopefully you can hear me at least. Let me pop my face up here. Great to see you all. 1,000 copies of me. Let me minimize this and just have this blank screen for a second while I pull up Blackboard. Great to see you all. Happy, what is it, Wednesday? A little bit odd to be teaching online. You don't walk places. You don't have all those cues for your memory system to tell you what day and when and why and where. Hopefully everyone's doing great. We are going to continue our discussion on vision that we began last time. Hopefully everyone has gotten a chance to begin working on some of the assignments that we've got for this week. We played around with our visual illusions last time. I thought that was kind of interesting and fun. We're going to do another similar demonstration today. We're actually going to play a bit of a game together, which is going to set you up to do your next assignment. We're not going to do the assignment itself together, but I will show you the basic building blocks of it. Looking at our schedule, you've got your chapters 3 and 4 multiple choice reading quizzes, as well as your short answers due, of course, everything due Sunday. You've got to do your zaps, this number from chapter 3 on your own. We're not doing it together, and these two in-class assignments. I think that's the main stuff to talk about. I told you guys about administrative stuff. Maybe rather than just talking in circles about all the stuff that's going on, it would be useful to just dive in, get a good head start, make sure we finish everything off, and maybe even end a little bit early, but no promises, of course. Before I do that, please, of course, sign into iClicker if you've not done that already. I had several people, I was kind of checking on that and saw that quite a few people had popped in. Still missing a few, though. And if you have any questions at all about content, grading, you name it, please, again, let me know. I've been sorting through my emails as fast as possible. If you reached out to me several days ago and you're still waiting to hear back, it's not that I don't want to reply. I'm just working my way through them as fast as I can. As a general note, and I will remind you about this later, when I've been grading short answer exams recently, you may find that I have lots and lots of numbers all over yours telling you the number of points that you got. But for most of you, you'll probably instead find that there's very few numbers, truly just in the interest of getting these back quickly. Yes. That's a great question, Julia. I'm trying to get that to be the case. In my power, yes. So stay tuned. Yeah, thank you for that. So about getting grades back before Sunday so you can see what you can improve. Stay tuned. So there's 60 people in this class, for example, and even if I go at my fastest as I'm grading and I read your responses fully, it takes me 3 to 5 minutes per person. So that's about 3 to 5 hours of grading, if I did the math right. So it just takes some time. I'm going quick. So you may find that you open yours up and you scroll down and there's nothing on it, but you've got like a 50 out of 50. What that means is I read all of them and I liked them and you did a great job and I had nothing to comment. If you find that there's some places where I like put a number, what I'm showing you there is how many points you earned out of that. So if there's a lot of like part 1 or one or 2 point questions where I'll just like write a 0 or a 1 next to it to show how many you got and just a little bit of feedback about what was going on. There's been a handful of common themes that have come up. Just some little minor consistent responses that I've noticed. Things like I've shown this one a bunch, or I've written this comment a bunch. In the faces and houses experiment, what stimuli were shown? People often said things like faces and houses. And you are correct. However, I do want a little bit more detail because I told you that it had faces and houses. So if you missed a point there, it's just because you kind of told me what I already told you. That was a common one. Let's see. People have done quite well on parts 1 and 2 generally. Been happy with that. Number 5 has been really good. In part B here, people would just kind of tell me EEG. And what I was looking for somewhere in here is some explanation as to why. It could have been here in B or here in C if you said that it's really good with timing. That's kind of what I wanted to know. It doesn't explicitly say why, but I do want some justification. So I usually gave like 1 point if I didn't see that anywhere instead of 2. So yeah, overall, I've been quite happy. Thanks for working hard. It's been quick to grade for most people's because you're doing a good job. If you have any questions about the feedback that you get, I maybe just wrote like more detail or something, and you're like, how do I make that and take that to improve? Reach out and I can clarify. So that's where that stands. I'm working my way through it. I've got about a dozen left before I can push those out to you. So yeah, overall very good. Thank you for working hard. Other questions before we move forward? Like no so far, which is great. All right. So I believe we left off kind of having established some of the basic principles of vision, and I want to try to wrap up chapter 3 here real quick, which means we've got 2 sections to talk about. And the main things that I want you to learn from today is a distinction between bottom-up and top-down processing. And these may be terms that you're not familiar with. I probably mentioned bottom-up a little bit, but one of the key themes that we're going to discuss today is this difference. So what are these? Why do we care? The long and short of it is that bottom-up processing is the pathways that we've been talking about so far. Starting in the eyes, the information moves on to the LGN. From the LGN, it moves on to V1. From V1, it moves on to V2. And we're gonna unpack this again. But the idea is that we are starting with very simple pieces. We assemble them to make something more complex. We assemble those to make something more complex again, and so on. And the idea is that you're slowly building something, some advanced understanding of what the visual world has in it by putting together simple parts until you get there. And the contrast that we are going to talk in the next section of slides about top-down processing, which is the exact opposite flow of information. That is, if you know something about what you are going to see or what you're likely to see, you use that information to guide your vision? And the answer seems to be yes. And so when we talk about how vision occurs, it is a combination of these 2 factors. So here's the pathways we've talked about so far, right? Here's the retina, here's LGN, here's V1, here's V2, V4. There's even a V3 over here. There's an area called MT that we think kind of does motion processing. These are rough approximations of what each location does. And you'll notice that these are things that we've talked about, right? So we know retina does just basic photon detection. LGN was doing our edge enhancement. And then V1 is where we've got those orientation specific cells. They look at a little patch of the visual field and they ask if this orientation is present. And then a different neuron looks at a different patch of the field and asks that same question, and so on. So for orientation, which is the direction of lines, vertical, horizontal, and so on, spatial frequency is whether lines are densely packed together or if there's more slower changes. So if you're looking at someone's face, there's lots of intricate details. That's more of a high frequency situation. Whereas if you're looking at like a table or something where the texture is very uniform until you reach the edge and then suddenly it changes, that's some more low frequency information. And there's a mixture of both everywhere. And even things like color. We talked about edges. That's where lines come together to form an intersection, and contours and textures. I'll show you some example here. But what I want us to see from this is that if I start at the retina and I know a photon or a bunch of photons are coming in, I can trace the paths that they follow through our brain. So they're going to hit the retina. The retina is going to pass that on to LGN. That's going to pass it on to V1, onto V2, onto V4. And so we're thinking about neural connections that move in this direction. And the reason we call it bottom is because you're starting with the smallest piece imaginable, a photon. And at the end, we're talking about recognizing that a face is present or something like that, which is much, much more complex. So what are the steps in this process? We've already learned a little bit. I went and dug up some interesting actual research to try to see what these things are doing to give us a sense of how you can combine simple things to build more complex things. And this is just one of many things that we think is going on in V2. So this is 2 or 3 or 4 steps upward in the processing stream. And what these researchers did is they took real images like this. There's a bunch of pea pods in a black and white picture, just kind of a thing that you might see in the world. And they say, okay, well, V1 is interested in orientation and it's interested in spatial frequency. Psychologists and neuroscientists love to use these things called Gabor patches, which is basically a combination of those two things. So I can have spatial frequencies that are relatively high, oriented in this direction. So high spatial frequency and oriented to this direction. Or I can change the orientation this way. Still high spatial frequency, but now the orientation is going a different direction. So I can kind of rotate this. But I can also change the frequency of the lines. I'm trying to make big blobs here with my pen. So same orientation as above, still going in this direction, but much lower spatial frequency, and so on. So we think this is what V1 is, part of what V1 is doing. It's finding edges, it's finding lines, it's finding how quickly they're alternating. And this is what they're representing here. Find my pen again. And the question then becomes, what happens if I have in V1 at every spatial location in the visual field, every little patch here, if I have some readout of which orientation and which spatial frequency or multiples of those are present? What happens if I can then add these up or bring these two spaces together and say, well, then what is there? And what they argue here is that there's something like texture. And so what they do through this computer algorithm is they try to show us what V2 might be seeing when it looks out at the world. And this is the kind of thing that they think they're seeing. These kind of messy, somewhat blurry, but notice that some of the details are maintained. There's things like shapes where an object kind of continues in one direction. There's like a blob here, and it kind of intersects with other blobs in interesting ways. And it's not quite the same as the original, of course, but what it's capturing is where those angles are and then how quickly the image is moving from dark to light. So the idea is that, okay, even at this step, retina, LGN, V1, V2, your brain already has this much information about what is out in the world. And that's pretty, pretty powerful. But what happens if we combine these textures together? Can we make something even more complex? And the answer is yes, right? So we just went from V1 to V2. What if we go from V2 to V4? Can we build up an even more complex thing out of these textures? Yes. This is one of the most mind-blowing studies I've ever seen. And so I definitely want to share it with you. This is a study using non-human primates. They have special cameras that can be illuminated with a special light. I believe what they're looking for here is calcium. I might be wrong about that. But what they did is they kind of opened up the side of this monkey's brain so they could look at it with a camera. This is different kinds of neuroimaging that we do with humans because we don't just do brain surgery on people. So if you do this right and carefully, you can not harm the animal long term. You can look inside of their brain using a camera, and you can literally watch the activity of the brain from the surface. So another limitation here is we're not getting deep into the cortex, but we're looking at the surface of the cortex. So a really cool technique. And what they then do is they presented in this study almost 20,000 different natural images. So things that this animal might see if it were to look out on the world. And for each one of those, they kind of did it over and over again. So they have several trials. They might present it 2 or 3 or 4 times, right? 20,000 image 2 or 3 or 4 times. They can even repeat those across multiple days. And what they can then say is, when I showed this picture, for example, where was there activity in the cortex? Excuse me. And each one of these brighter regions is showing an area where there's a lot of activity and lots of neurons firing. The darker regions are places where there's very few neurons firing. And of course, every time you present that image, you get a slightly different pattern, but you can see that they're quite similar. That there's like a dot and a dot and a dot and a dot, and I can kind of find those same dots here and those dots here. So this is not single cell recording. This is the entire, as much as the V4 as we can see, this is millions upon neurons all showing us roughly what they're doing from a very zoomed out perspective. And so we can say, okay, well, what part of the brain responds to this stimulus? What part of the brain responds to this stimulus? What part of the brain responds to this stimulus? And we can do that for 20,000 different images. And you can build, when you do this, a gigantic atlas of where in this monkey's mind, or in their brain, different stimuli seem to be processed. So we've been talking about, the fusiform gyrus, or the fusiform face area, and we said, here's a big chunk of brain and it seems to do faces. It's the same idea here, where we're looking at, again, a large patch of brain, different technique, but we're saying, okay, what kind of stimulus makes this part of the brain turn on? So this is that entire region that they were just showing. Notice how large this is, right? This is 1 millimeter. So this is about a maybe 4-ish millimeter patch by 5 or 6 this way. So it's really not very large. And yet we can map out what's happening here. So this is a tiny chunk of V4, but what they're doing is then showing all these pictures, and then what they kind of did is built this atlas, and they give us these blown up regions where I can talk about a very specific little piece of cortex and say, what stimuli make this area fire? And then there's a challenge of us looking at it, trying to make sense and find patterns, but you can see some, right? There's kind of a red patch and a yellow patch and a blue patch and a green patch and a purple patch and a, I don't know, pinkish patch. There's a different blue patch down here. Look at all these browns and grays and blacks, and maybe there's some yellow. Okay, and then they look at these boundaries, and you can, what they're doing here is they're showing the 9 images that made this part of the brain respond the most strongly. We see that there's things like fruits maybe that are kind of yellow. We see like all these blue splotches down here. If we look down here at this part of cortex, we can see that we're looking at like these curved shapes against a bright or a dark background. There's stripes in various places. Look at this patch here of a bunch of human faces. Here's like geometric shapes, like dots on a white plane or triangles, right? So what they're showing with this is that there is some kind of consistency in the way that this monkey's brain is organized, where after processing and building out of simple pieces, there's organization. If you read this, if you look at this part of the brain, you can guess quite accurately what was being shown to the monkey. And they actually did that. They reversed this, or no, I'm sorry. These are categories that they found. They kind of said that there's some face-like things, some like other mouth kind of shapes, some textures, pink things, who knows. But then they could also flip this around. Oh man, I guess that's what's being shown here. You can then look at this and you can say, okay, if the brain were active here and here and here and here, what is the monkey likely see? So they built up a really nice understanding of what V4 is doing. So even though this is just a handful of connections, if the retina has, let's say, on the order of about 4 synapses, and for simplicity, which this is a huge oversimplification, let's pretend there's just one here, one here, one here, and one here. We're talking about 7-ish synapses involved in this process, and already the brain can differentiate between very different kinds of stimuli. And these stimuli have this nice organization. So this is the heart of our bottom-up processing. The question is, how do we look at our big complex world? How does our brain respond? Well, it's sorting through, sifting through, organizing, collecting similar kinds of things together, all the way by the time it gets to V4. This is bottom up. Okay, so is that the end of the story? Actually, no, it's not even the end of the story. The main thing that the second idea that I want to convey within this set of slides is what's being shown over here on the right side in these different colors. As soon as I find my pin again, we have this nice little tiny red dot that I have to find to figure out where my pin currently is. This separation here between this red pathway and this green pathway. So in your previous exam, I asked you, why do we care about the anatomical structure of the brain? Why do we want to know how it's shaped? Well, because it's supposed to tell us something about function. Here's a really clear anatomical separation. Information flows this way, and it goes into our temporal cortex. But a different pathway, if we trace out neuron connections, flows into an entirely different part of our brain that takes us up to our parietal cortex. And these two regions don't talk. right? There is no cross connections here. So what this seems to suggest is that these two parts of the brain are doing something different. They're doing different jobs. And all these regions here, you don't need to worry about. I just like the diagram for showing how much we know about the way these diverge. And you might even recognize one of these regions from our face processing unit. Here's my pen. This is driving me crazy. The inferotemporal cortex, the bottom of the temporal lobe, what lives over here? Things like the FFA/fusiform gyrus, the PPA, and so on, that we've learned a little bit about. So what are these pathways? Why do we care? We have determined that there are two separate ways that our brain processes vision. One of them goes this direction up towards the parietal lobe. Here's parietal roughly. And this part is responsible for determining where in space various objects are. So we are dividing the task of what in the world am I seeing in front of me into specialized regions. So in the parietal pathway, we are trying to figure out where objects are located. This is really useful for us as animals that live in the three-dimensional world that need to interact with it. I might need to know exactly where something is so I can grab it, or so I can not get hit by it if it's a ball flying at my face, for example. And so this pathway does where processing. And you'll notice the direction that it's moving towards. What is up here? Primary somatosensory cortex, where we feel things in our body. And what's right over here? Primary motor cortex, where we begin to produce motor movements in our body. It's no surprise that when we start thinking about this more multiple lobe organization of the brain, that occipital works with parietal and maybe even works in some part with frontal to help us figure out where things are, where my body currently is, and what kind of motor actions I need to do to interact with it. These parts of the brain are near each other. So that's, again, some nice organization that has made this process of decoding what this massive complicated organ is doing, is there are some nice similar areas and similar jobs. If a person has brain damage here, they have a type of inability to reach for objects. And so they can, it's very confusing when you interact with someone like this, because it breaks all intuition that we have about the world. You can put an object out in front of them and they will be absolutely unable to tell you where it is, but they can tell you precisely what it is. They might be able to say, oh, I see a pair of scissors. And you say, okay, cool, grab that pair of scissors. And scissors are interesting because they have this kind of handedness to them. And so you can use that as an experimental manipulation. You can have them set, I have a pair of scissors right here. Or you can have them set in this orientation so that I need to grab them like this. Or you can have them set in this orientation, so I would have to do something different, right? I'd have to reach with a different hand. Well, I can, if I'm a person that has damage to my wear pathway, I can tell you, oh, it's a pair of scissors. They've got black handles. They're shiny, whatever else details. But when it came to reaching, I would either miss or I would come at it with the wrong kind of grip. It's counterintuitive. It really highlights just how distinct these different processes are. So if that's the where system, we also have a what system that we're already somewhat familiar with, because we've talked about this the inferior temporal cortex where the FFA was living before, where we were doing all that face recognition. You might have had in the back of your mind, wait a second, I thought the occipital lobe was doing vision. Why is the temporal lobe getting involved here? Well, the answer is that the occipital lobe is doing some of the basic stuff, but it passes that information out of occipital, borrows some help from nearby lobes to process it. And this, by the way, is why we say approximately 50% of our brain is involved in some way with vision. We recruit a lot of these regions too. Skip the face recognition unit. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Well, there's an area down here called FFA that we will talk about here in a minute. And so again, this is counterintuitive when we think about brain damage. A person can, let's say there's damage right here. A person can absolutely reach for a coffee cup in just the right way. Again, a nice little demonstration. I don't currently have a coffee cup in front of me. I do have my Stanley, of course. And so this is my stand-in. So you can again place this object out in front of a person, and the handle and where the handle is determines how you interact with it. A person with a fully functioning wear system will reach out and grab and be surprised because they don't know what they're grabbing. They don't know what this is. If we said, hey, what is that? They'd say, I don't know. There's something there. And you say, okay, reach out and grab it. They will do the correct grasp. And then they will say, well, what the heck am I holding on to? I don't actually know what it is, but I do know where it is. We call this visual agnosia. This is the inability to name. So agnosia, no naming. They cannot name what they are seeing because their what pathway has been damaged. So here's the area I've been alluding to a bunch. Here's occipital in the back. Here's frontal. We're looking up at from the bottom of the brain. And this is our temporal lobe. And this region highlighted in green is what we call the fusiform gyrus. It's a gyrus because it's that bumpy bit, not the sulci down in between. And this is where we seem to do some distinct kind of processing. So if I show a face, a human face, this area of the brain is going to show a lot of activation, kind of like we were just seeing with that monkey where there's that V4 was showing activation for faces. Fusiform gyrus loves faces. And there's even other areas nearby that really love looking at buildings or locations in the world. And the idea here is that we are deep now into the processing. We're going to actually be thinking about posterior temporal cortex versus anterior, so which means back versus front. And the degree of complexity for processing, the more specific and nuanced judgments of what we are looking at actually progress along this direction as well, where you get more general kinds of categories here and very, very, very specific kinds of visual recognition happening here. So if you want to know where in the brain you know about what your friend's face is, so that when you see your friend, you know that they're your friend Bob, this is kind of the region you're going to want to look for to find the specific little bits of neurons that are responding when you see Bob, but not when you see Jane and not when you see a dog or someone else. Okay, so these two pathways are very important. They do different jobs for us. There's a bit of a divide and conquer approach. Right? There's a lot to do. Not only do we have to figure out what kind of orientations, but now we're combining combinations of combinations of combinations of combinations. This creates really a computational explosion. If I've got 10 orientations and I've got 10 different spatial locations that they can be in, and I've got 10 spatial frequencies, and I've got 10 colors, and I've got 10 crosses that I need to explore, and so on, the number of different things that our brain has to check or combine or try and look for becomes very, very large very quickly. And so this is why we've got so much of our brain space devoted to this. As we are trying to do all these different difficult tasks, we say, all right, this part of the brain, just figure out where it is. Don't worry about what it is. Okay, this part of the brain, you figure out what it is. Don't worry about where. And that's great. That's very efficient. But it also creates a bit of a problem, which is, I like to think of it as kind of the Humpty Dumpty problem. What the field actually calls it is the binding problem, which is the fact that we've now divided our visual processing into two different streams that happen to be very far apart. And now we've got to put it back together if we want to know what we're looking at and where it is, which is of course important. This is a coffee mug over here. It's great to know which those two pieces, but we do want to put them together. And that's a bit of a question, right? So in this divide and conquer world, my brain up here and my brain over here are working on the same problem and they need to talk to each other. So how do they do that? This is the binding problem. And this is a little kind of graphical representation, a little cartoon that helps illustrate this idea. If I were, for example, to present this stimulus, I guess these stimuli, two of them, and you're looking at them, and there's a red square and there's a teal circle. If I were to think about how your brain is doing this, there's some step, probably around V2-ish, where you're getting information about what shapes are there, right? So we saw V2 does these kind of cornerish things. This might even be V3, where we're getting basic shapes. And there's other parts of our brain, I think around V1, where we're getting things like color detection. We might have some activation in inferior temporal cortex that's really, so let's call this the what pathway for like shapes. There's a bunch of different brain regions spread throughout this entire stream that are now telling me, hey, there's red stuff somewhere. There's teal stuff somewhere. There's a square somewhere. There's a circle somewhere. And so if you imagine that there's some set of neurons somewhere whose job it is to look for squares, that set of neurons is going to be firing like crazy, saying, hey, there's a square somewhere, right? This is those neurons firing. And the circle neurons are firing quite a bit because they're saying, hey, there's a circle somewhere. But remember, we put this into the what pathway, and this is in the where pathway. And so we know, yes, there is, I'm sorry, not this. This is where. We know that there's something over here and there's something over here, and we know that there's a square thing somewhere and there's a teal thing somewhere. The binding problem is how we put these things together. Add those together. So how do we do that? Well, there's quite a bit of machinery that we've already kind of learned about. As we've seen from the beginning, as we've thought about what V1 is doing, remember the idea of receptive fields, which is that they're only really looking at one little corner of the world at a time. Each little set of neurons can only look at one little corner of the world. So if that information is maintained, let's say the neurons that are looking at this corner for orientation, if they talk to neurons that are over here looking for color, and if there are connections to neurons over here that are looking for shapes and so on, if these neurons can talk to each other, then it's already kind of automatically possible for these neurons to combine their different inputs, right? They include not just what they're looking for, but a little bit about where they found it in the first place, that idea of receptive fields. So that gives our brain the clue, the possibility for making sure that these different kinds of features can come back together. That's great. So you might be able to, with this, maybe kind of superimpose, hey, there's a red thing over here-ish. Hey, there's a square thing over here-ish. But the binding problem talks about not just saying there's a red thing there and a square thing there, but about unifying them together as the perception of a single object. The idea that we interpret the red and the square belonging to the same thing, not just there's a pile of red input and there's a square there, but actually linking them together. And we do think that some of this is accomplished via neural synchrony, which is when we look at the brain, we know that this is a time-based process. I present a stimulus. After that stimulus appears, neurons will start to fire with some delay. The amount of delay depends on the exact pathway that signal has taken through the brain, the strength of the similarity between what the neurons are looking for and what is out there. And the general idea of neural synchrony is that if there are populations that are responding to the same stimulus, if there's one group of neurons in one part of the brain and a different group of neurons in a different part of the brain, but they're both responding to this stimulus, notice that this stimulus appeared at the same time. And so these two signals in the brain are likely to start at about the same time, and they're likely to have some kind of similar firing rates, which is what we call synchrony. Synchrony doesn't mean that they have to fire at the same time. It just means that they are consistently firing, like kind of in a time consistent fashion. So even if I had like fire, 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 where they're not at the exact same time, they're still reliably predictable relative to each other. Whereas if I had something like fire, 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 and this is more like that, they are way less contingent and related to each other. So this idea of neural synchrony is that populations of neurons anywhere in the brain are going to have some aspect of when they are firing that is shared, if they're coming from the same object. And then finally, there's another mechanism that we know of from behavior, which is the idea of attention, which we will talk about in chapter 5, where the idea is that we know that our visual processing gives us lots of parallel detection for individual features, but we have a separate ability called attention, which lets us stick them together. Where attention in some ways is defined as the thing that lets us put information together. When I say parallel detection, what I'm referring to is this process right here. Simultaneously, every location is being checked for every feature, and different neurons are doing all those jobs. So this is have you ever heard of the clothesline problem? It's sometimes a bit tricky. It's used to think about creative reasoning. The clothesline problem says if I've got, let's say 5 shirts and I want to dry them all out, I can put them on the clothesline and maybe it only takes 1 hour for my 5 shirts to dry. It's like, okay, that makes sense, no problem. And then you can ask someone then, okay, what if I've got, all right, I'm sorry, let me do this in the classic framing. If I've got 3 shirts and it takes 3 hours to dry. You can say, okay, cool, 3 shirts, 3 hours. Then you ask someone, what if I've got 10 shirts? How long will it take those shirts to dry? One of the answers that people find intuitive and they jump to very quickly is they'll also say, well, if I've got 3 shirts in 3 hours, then if I've got 10 shirts, it must take 10 hours for them to dry, right? There's this one-to-one correspondence where the number of shirts is equal to the number of hours. So if I've got 10 shirts, it must be 10 hours. But this is a clothesline. You can put lots and lots of shirts on the same clothesline and they can all dry at the same time. And so it will still take, in this case, 3 hours for the shirts to dry. As long as your clothesline is long enough, you can pin up 1,000 shirts and they'll all dry in 3 hours. So there's this kind of sense of, this is kind of a fun little cognitive problem solving thing that sometimes trips people up. But the process that's being illustrated here is the idea of parallel processing, which is that lots and lots of things can all happen at the same time, and none of them are slowed down or sped up just because there's something else happening right next to it. All the shirts are drying just as fast as a shirt will dry. Doesn't matter if there's 10 shirts to my left or 10 shirts to my right. Our brain utilizes parallel processing. It checks for every orientation, every color, every cross, every motion direction, and so on at all the different corners of our visual field, because there's different neurons that are responsible for all of that. And so they can each do it independently of whether or not there's some other neurons somewhere else doing their job too. Massive parallel detection of all these things in our visual field all the time. However, when it comes to binding, it does seem like there is a very strict serial process, which means that it occurs in sequence. I showed you an example in chapter 1 where we talked about stimulus encoding. And then after that was comparison. And then after that was response selection and production. This is a serial process because things occur in a strict order, whereas in a parallel process, you can have multiple things happening at the same time. So we have parallel detection of all these individual features, but attention is going to operate in a serial fashion. How do we know this? Turns out that we knew this before we were even looking for it in the brain. Thanks to a research study by Treisman and Glad, one of the most cited papers of all time, like tens or hundreds of thousands of citations, because this is proven to be so consistent, so reliable, and so important for how we think about vision. And the experiment is actually quite simple. They asked people to look at stimuli like this. And so there's this, on the computer screen, they would present a bunch of very simple shapes. And in this case, what they're presenting is a bunch of brown letter T's and a bunch of purple letter T's, and they're just kind of randomly arrayed all over the screen. But critically, there's one special, unique little letter T here, which is in pink. And participants' job on every trial of this experiment was to press a button as soon as they knew, is the T present or is it absent? So they had a bunch of displays where there's a bunch of brown and purple T's, slightly different locations on each trial, so you didn't know where to look. And then some of those trials, the T was present, and some of the trials, the T was absent, the pink one that they were looking for. And what you'll maybe notice as I put more and more T's into this, even red T's, it really doesn't matter. I can have lots and lots of distractors here. But no matter how many distractors I show you, this pink T is extremely easy to find. It is extremely easy to find because it only relies on that color information and literally nothing else. I don't have to know, is it pink but also this shape? Is it pink but also rotated this way? Is it pink but also... None of that matters. Just pink. I can even squint my eyes, right, and just kind of get the sense of where the colors were as just blobs in my vision, and I would still be incredibly good at this because all I care about is if it's pink. This is a kind of distinct way. Serial, very good. Let me spell it out for us. Serial is S-E-R-I-A-L, and it means in strict fashion, strict order. So if you, let's say you have to run a handful of errands, right? You want to go to the bank, you want to go to the grocery store, you want to go home. You cannot do all of those things at once. You've got to pick some order. So you'll first go to the bank, then the grocery, then to home. There is no way to do that at the same time. And you can pick a different order, of course, right? You could start here, then go here, and then go here. You can do it in whatever order you want, but you still have to do it one by one. Compared with a parallel process, which is where if you had 3 people, let's say, you could send one friend to the bank at the same time that you go to the grocery, at the same time that someone else goes to your home. So if you have 3 people, each of them can do a different job, and everyone can start at the same time, and heck, you might even all finish at the same time. This is a lot faster to do 3 things. You just need more resources to do it in some ways. So our brain utilizes this kind of approach. If you remember that like 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 number I was throwing at you, right? This is a lot of computations. But if I have this many neurons and each neuron just has to check for one, they can do it all basically instantly. And this is actually huge for our vision. The fact that I can look at our massive visual field and instantly extract orientations, colors, and everything else is because I've got so many neurons, each doing their own little job in parallel. So parallel processing, super important. Parallel processing, exactly what happens in this case. I can scan the entire field in an instant with the simple question of, is there pink? And as soon as I've got the answer that there's pink somewhere, I'm done. But what happens if I make the stimulus something more complex, like this? Similar task. I'm now looking for, again, a letter, but this time it is a pink O that is hiding within pink N's and green O's. And so you might be tempted to use the same strategy and say, is there pink? And of course you'll say, yeah, there's definitely pink. Oh, but wait, shoot, there's pink N's. That's not what I need. I need to know if it's a pink O. And so maybe again, you have the question like, okay, is there O? And of course, yes, there is. Look at all these O's. They're everywhere. Okay, but shoot, they're green and I need the pink one. So in this version of the task, there is no way to boil it down to a single feature that can be done in parallel everywhere all at once. Yes, I know if there's pinks. Yes, if I know if there's O's, but I specifically need to know if there is an O and pink in the exact same location. That is the binding problem. Our brain needs to do more than just detect the one, detect the other. We've got to stick them together. And so what seems to happen here, and I'll show you the data that supports this, is a serial search process. People will pick somewhere random to focus their eyes or to focus their attention. They'll focus some special processing resources in one little region of space, like right here, and they can say, okay, is there O? Check. Is there pink? No. Okay, so this is not the location. And then they'll jump over here, let's say, and maybe they'll see these and they'll say, okay, is there O? Yep. Is there pink? Nope. Okay. Guess this isn't here. And they'll jump over here and they'll say, is there O? No. Okay, so it's not there. Okay. And you scan this over and over and over again, picking somewhat intelligently, but somewhat randomly, until you either give up, in which case you would make the wrong answer. You'd say, no, it's not present, and you get it wrong, and they tell you to do a better job. Or, you keep searching, and then finally you land over here and you say, okay, yes, I finally did find it. So the simplest version of this is you will scan every single item one by one by one by one in a somewhat random order until you either have scanned every item and said, no, it's not present, or you stumble on it and you say, okay, there it is. So this is a cognitive model, right? This is an argument about a mental process. This research was actually done before we had the ability to do eye tracking. We also know that attention is certainly used with our eyes, but it doesn't need our eyes. We can actually move our attention around without moving our eyes. And they did this research, and let me erase some things here so we can see it. Here's the class. This is like the graph that shows the main result. These flat lines here were cases like this, where it was a single thing where it just popped out. And what they're showing here is it doesn't matter if there's one thing to look at, if there's 5 things, 5 T's, if there's 15 T's, if there's 30 T's. People have done this with like 200 T's scattered in on the screen. And it doesn't matter if there's 200, people are basically the same speed at finding yes or no, that critical stimulus was there. And so the idea is that you can do this without having to need some kind of sequential serial search process. It happens in parallel. But by contrast, we've got these dark solid lines. You'll notice that the more items I add into the display, the longer and longer it takes. So by the time I've added 30 things, you're going to have to scan a whole lot more of them on average before you find, okay, I checked all 30 and it wasn't there, or I happened to check the 12th one and that's where it finally was, and so I respond. And so this is how we know that the binding problem is something that our brain has to solve. You can potentially make this better if you practice over and over and over again. I've actually done some work on this with people who did the same thing for like months, and they got pretty good, but you can never completely get rid of this binding problem. So that's the idea between our what and our where pathways. Lots of visual processing to do. We divide it up into the brain, and then we got to put it back together again in certain situations, and that's critical for how we think about our vision. So we do have some limitations. A theme that we're going to talk about a bunch is that cognition is always somewhat limited. There are some things that we can do seemingly over as many things as we want. We'll talk about automaticity in chapter 5. We'll talk about memory, where we can seemingly store an infinite number of things in certain kinds of memory. But there are always some limitations in terms of either how much you can store or how quickly you can get to it. There's a trade-off somewhere. So we can do very simple things, as many simple things as we want, but as soon as we want to do something more complex, there's a bit of a bottleneck. Okay, so that's our bottom-up pathway. We can get quite good sense of what things are, where they are, just starting with photons and going forward. But what happens if we know what's out in the world? What happens if I have knowledge? Like, what happens if I'm walking into a library and I see some kind of blurry thing in the distance and I can say, it's probably a book, right? And it turns out that it is a book. Am I just, you know, prescient? Do I have knowledge of the future? Or did I somehow take my knowledge that I've learned through my life and use it to help my visual system when there was some uncertainty? And so we're going to talk about this general problem of what we call top-down perception. And this is my favorite example. I show this in like all my classes because eventually perception comes up. And here's the logic. From a bottom-up perspective, oops, not Buddham, these two stimuli are perfectly identical. Right? I could take this one and move it over here and they would line up exactly. So if there's any difference in what you think you are looking at, we cannot explain this from bottom up because these two are identical. Now, what are these? They could be a lot of things. It could just be like a fun little shape that I made. It kind of looks like an H, so maybe this is my logo for Dr. Harding. It could be a ladder. It could be some train tracks. This could be a lot. What is it? Any of those is fine, but let me add some context. Let me add some additional information. Notice that I've not changed the original thing at all. I've just put some stuff around it. And when I've put some stuff around it, maybe now you have the sense that this is THE. Excellent. Okay, and it kind of just jumps out at you. I didn't have to tell you this. If I were to just show this without all my setup, you would have just immediately recognized it as the letter H without probably thinking about it twice. But what about this one on the right? Excellent question, Julia. You're not dumb. You're actually quite smart. What Julia reports having seen is the letter A with the top cut off, because that's also a completely valid interpretation of what this shape is. Now, again, without having to tell you this, you probably saw this as cat, where now this is an A. So the exact same physical stimulus can be interpreted by your brain as two completely different things. So how in the world do we explain this? From the bottom-up perspective, we're kind of stuck because we're passing simple things on to more complex and on to more complex. They're starting from the same place. It's going to end in the same place. They've got to be the same. So how do we account for this? This is the heart of top-down perception. And we're going to be looking at it from a couple different perspectives, including things like form perception, which is letters, objects, shapes, etc. Where our mind fills in the blanks, it tells us that there's something more than just the raw information there. We go beyond the basic building blocks that we started with. We go beyond the information given. And there's a lot of fun illusions that play into this, which is, by the way, why we started with illusions. Illusions tap into this idea quite strongly. So this is a Necker cube. This is a kind of classic little fun game that a person named Necker invented. They kind of stumbled on this and they said, this is an interesting shape. It has a bistable perception, which means you can look at this and depending on your kind of frame of mind, you can either see it kind of like where the face is right on and looking at you, or you can see it where the face is kind of up here. I personally always see this one much more easily, by the way. I have to kind of like, I've come up with a strategy, honestly, for seeing it. I kind of imagine that I'm standing like above a box that I'm about to be putting stuff into, and that gives me a sense of like this alternative perception. You might see it differently, but the idea is that the raw input itself is ambiguous. Either one of these is a completely valid interpretation. You have maybe a preference, but you can switch back and forth. So there's something more here than just what the image itself is. Here's another example of a bistable percept. If you look at the black regions, you'll see two faces of people who are very close to each other. Maybe they're about to share some spaghetti, Lady and the Tramp style, I don't know. Or if you focus on the white region, you see this nice little candelabra, which is sitting here burning oh so brightly. And again, it's ambiguous. It can be both. Depending on which frame of mind you're in and what kind of information I'm giving you at the moment will bias your perception. But the raw stimulus has not changed. I'm not secretly animating these shapes in the background, that they're not moving at all. And so this turns out to be kind of useful because the world is confusing. The world is ambiguous. The world has all kinds of messy visual inputs, but it doesn't care. It's kind of up to us to figure out what to do with these. Oh, interesting ink blot question. I'll come back to that in a sec. So the world is not setting itself up to present for us the perfect, unambiguous visual information. The world just is. And if we want to figure out what the world contains, we've got to resolve these ambiguous cases. We've got to interpret. We've got to make some sense of it. And a simple case here. Here's like a still life of fruit in a bowl with a vase behind it. But notice that the bottom of the vase is completely cut off, but I can probably infer that it's there. I can make a good guess that it's probably there and that it's probably sitting on a table, even though I don't see the edge of the table. That probably looks like this. Over here, there's completely black pixels, like there's no information, but I bet that that's about where the table is, right? Or if I focus on the fruit bowl, I've got this blob over here, which is kind of red and textured in a certain way, and then this is red and textured in a certain way. And these could either be two pieces of fruit or one piece of fruit. And I kind of have this sense, so these are labeled as B and E. I have this sense that this seems like a single apple that's kind of here and just blocked by this banana, right? I even know it's a banana, even though one of the most distinct features of a banana is kind of that like stem part at the top, right? That, where you often peel it. Although monkeys peel from the bottom. And so I've started doing that and I actually prefer it. So a little life tip there. You don't see this little bit here, but you can infer that it's probably down here, right? You are making a lot of guesses about this situation. You don't think that there's some kind of weird, crazy three-dimensional shape that has that kind of shape to it that you've never seen before and will never see again. You read between the lines, you fill in the blanks and you add something to it. So good question about ink blots, by the way. Charlotte was asking. I think it's going to tap into something similar where the ink blot itself is, I mean, ultimately nothing is injected into it. It's very random. I'm sure there's some kind of art of how you put the ink on the page and so that you get something useful. I've never made one, but I bet there's something to that. But the artist or the person creating it isn't putting into it anything on purpose. But our mind likes to find structure. It likes to read between the lines. And so you absolutely can find shapes or you can find other things in it. And yeah, it's been used as like a diagnostic tool where they're like, okay, well, the things that you see in it reveal quite a bit about you. You know, it's a little bit like that introspective approach where it's hard to know how diagnostic that might be. But that's a really great example, right? Ambiguity, still, we want to make sense of it. Right? Remember, we are biological animals that live in a world that is way, way bigger than us. And all we have are our own sensations and knowledge. And we've got to go out there and we've got to find food. We've got to make predictions about what's coming next. It is very useful for us to be able to find patterns, even if those patterns aren't really there. If they are and we miss them, that could be potentially harmful. So our mind loves to find patterns in the world, and this is just one of the many ways that we do that. And again, this is just some more fun examples. At first glance, you may not find this, see what's happening here. You might be focusing on the black shapes. And if you do, you're a bit confused about what I'm showing. But if you instead focus on the negative space here, you'll see the word lift. And companies love this kind of stuff. Graphic designers love this stuff. Once you see the negative space arrow here in the FedEx logo, it's hard to not see it again. And I just went and found a bunch of other examples of this because they're fun. So the Pittsburgh Zoo and Aquarium, we've got the tree and the white, and then we've got the two animal heads that are coming together to make the tree. We got the Bronx Zoo with the giraffe and the buildings, right? So if I know nothing about the Bronx, which, you know, what does the Bronx look like? Hey, there must be buildings there, right? Very clever. The one in the Formula One logo is in negative space. And the Hope for African Children initiative uses two people looking at each other to outline the shape of Africa. So really, really clever stuff here. So and our brain does this, our mind does this by filling in ambiguity, by looking for forms, for looking for shapes. All of these are kind of bistable situations. Just one more fun thing. The word perception, none of these letters is actually written out. The edges, the top and the left edge are not shown at all, but you can fill in where they would be. So again, from a bottom-up perspective, this presents a problem because what am I looking at here? It's this weird dark blobby shape that I've never seen before, right? Now there's a blobby shape here and here and here. Like what in the heck am I looking at? We need something more than just bottom-up if we want to explain how we see any of these. And by the way, we owe a lot of this to the Gestalt psychologists, who are a bunch of German psychologists in about the 1930s. They were doing some of this early work, and they were curious in trying to catalog all the different aspects of this that they could find. I've kind of just thrown a few fun examples at you, but they took this as kind of a rigorous pursuit. They said, what are all the ways that people are bringing, kind of injecting structure into what they see? And here's just a couple. They noted that people tend to group things together by similar features. So this is, in some ways, just 16 dots that happen to be near each other. But when I look at it, I kind of see like an orange group of dots and a red group of dots and an orange group of dots and a red group of dots. I kind of perceive this as 4 columns of dots by tapping into color. And neither one of those is right or wrong, but it's kind of what jumps out to me. We also tend to utilize proximity to group things together. Again, this is just 16 dots that are somewhat randomly scattered around. But again, I kind of immediately jump to this sense that there's 3 clusters. This is your brain trying to find patterns in the world. Our fruit bowl example was one of good continuation, with the sense that perhaps the simplest explanation for what I'm looking at here is that there's a single green bar that is just being blocked by our orange cylinder. I see stuff like this all the time. I'm actually, you know, here's my Stanley. It's blocking things in my visual world. I see this 1,000 times a day. It's a reasonable and simple explanation rather than trying to invent a world where there's an orange thing with green stuff sticking off the sides randomly. We also do closure, perceiving figures as whole, even though they're broken. And we have this bias towards simplicity. The simplest explanation here is that there are 2 rectangles that happen to be laying on top of each other, not that there's some very complex 12-sided shape that we are encountering in the world. So what they're trying to catalog here, there's like 30 of these, I just showed us 5, that show that we do more than just take the raw information, we organize it, we summarize it, we take knowledge, we take past experience, and we bring that all to bear. This is top-down perception. So this is how those illusions fool us in so many ways, is we're pretty good at understanding the structure of the world. we automatically bring this in, and it's very hard to turn off. Just like it's very hard to turn off that bottom-up processing, we don't have a lot of control over which orientations are being detected anywhere. We are also bringing a lot of this top-down information to bear, and it's also hard to turn off. And this is why we get illusions, is you can design situations where your top-down kind of leads you astray. So here's just some more. I will move quick through this so we have time to do everything today. This is a blob of black and white. You have no idea what this is. Let me convince you that top-down is really hard to turn off. So right now this looks like nothing, but I'm going to show you some information. Here is the unblurry version. Now you know what this is. When I come back here, now you know what this is. You cannot turn off that knowledge that I just gave you. You can't scrub it out of your mind and like remove that somehow so that you're not seeing the horse face. It's just there. And now you're stuck with it, right? This is part of what makes top-down so pervasive. We live in a world full of structure and regularity, and we learn it through trial and error. And then it colors everything we see. We use it no matter what. By the way, if you're interested in art, the Impressionists in France were really interested in this kind of thing. You'll notice that the basic building blocks of what they're doing here are just these little like dashes and lines. But what they create here is an impression that goes beyond just the sum of those individual parts. They were actually trying to, I'd say the nice crossover is they were trying to take their introspection and put that on canvas. They were trying to see in the mind's eye and communicate it in this way. So they're really trying to think about how we can leverage more than just the individual pieces, the individual brush strokes here. We infer structures, we infer shapes, we infer the time of day, and many other things out of those simpler pieces. We do this in a lot of other ways. I'm just going to show you some inferences that we make automatically, like an apple that moves closer or further away from us. We don't perceive that the apple is changing size. Hello, PowerPoint. Sorry for that. PowerPoint decided to crash. We don't have the illusion that the apple is changing size. We know that the apple is getting bigger and smaller because it's moving relative to us. I don't think that it's like growing or shrinking as it's moving through space. That would be confusing. That's never happened before. We also know that this apple is not being destroyed and recreated in the exact same spot, but in a slightly different orientation. We know that this is the same apple that is rotating and that the back and the front are going to look different. And so as objects move around us, we understand that it is the same object, even though it looks very different. When we think about the retina, right? Here's an apple that's really, really far away. When it strikes our retina, it's going to strike a tiny little piece of it. When the apple is closer, it's going to strike a larger piece of our retina, and when it's closer still, it's going to hit a different part. The bottom-up information is fundamentally different, but we perceive these as being the same object as it moves around or as we move around it. And another example of what we call shape constancy is where the door changes. The door does not change its actual shape, it just changes its orientation, so it goes from a rectangle to a trapezoid. We, again, do not have the sense that the door has morphed into a completely different kind of thing. It just moved, right? This is some of the ways that our visual system helps us navigate the world. This is why top-down perception is so useful, is because it helps us understand that the world that strikes our retinas is a lens, and that there's more information that we can bring to bear, and we're using both of those together to actually know what's out there, right? I can reach for the door handle and know what's going to happen because I know how objects work. We also do this with depth. We perceive depth in a million different ways. Here are 6 of them that we use. We use things like objects that are in front of other objects block seeing the things in back. So this woman is clearly closer to me than the building because her body blocks me seeing the building. So now I know where they are relative to each other. Oftentimes we can see a horizon, and so things that are closer to the horizon are going to be further away from me than things that are down here very far away from the horizon. Even familiar size, which is to say, I know how big, relative size is C. Here's a human being, and they are about this big. Here's a different human being, and they are about this big. Even though people are different sizes, this person is clearly larger, and so he must be closer to me. What about familiar size? Well, I know that cars are big, so if I see a tiny little car in my vision, it must be far away. We also have linear perspective, which is where lines converge into the distance. And so something located here on these lines is going to be closer than something located here as they get closer to convergence. And finally, we have texture gradients, where the pattern here is far apart, but as it goes into the distance, these lines get closer and closer and closer together. So we automatically utilize all of these cues. No one has to tell you to do this. You did have to learn some of these perhaps developmentally, but now that you're a mature visual system, you instantaneously can build a three-dimensional representation of this, even though it's not even a picture, right? It's pixels on your computer screen. Like, there's so many layers of abstraction here, but you can still fill in how the world is structured. We even do this with motion. Objects that are close to us quickly move across our visual field. Objects that are very far away move much more slowly. You ever drive in a car and look out the window and the telephone poles are rushing past you at 1,000 miles an hour, and somehow that line of trees or mountains in the distance looks like it hasn't moved at all in the last hour. That's what we call motion parallax. Close things move fast, far things seem to move slow. I'll skip that for now. So perception as a whole is the combination of both of these. We use bottom-up information, right? There's lines, edges, colors, intersections, motion, textures, and so on. That bottom-up pathway that starts at the retina and goes deep into the brain contains a bunch of information. We absolutely need that. If you close your eyes, you can probably guess what's out there, but that won't last for very long as you navigate the world. We absolutely need to be collecting light to know what's in front of us, but it's not alone. We utilize top-down knowledge, surrounding information, like in our example of the cat. We have knowledge about the world, like how apples are shaped, and so if there's one thing blocking it, I can still infer the apple, and so on and so on. Another fun example, just to keep doing this, right? We don't know what this shape over here is. I just kind of ruined it because I went on too fast. But we have no idea what this is. This is nonsense. This is just lines. But when you add the context, now it takes on a particular form. This is a line drawing from our friend Picasso. As I said, the Impressionists love this stuff. So vision is both. We need to understand both. So why do all those visual illusions trick us? Well, because our visual system uses knowledge and experience together with that data to make educated guesses about the environment that allow us to adaptively respond. You can then hack all of those guesses, all those educated guesses. You can find creative ways to tap into those and to use those against people instead of for their benefit. So this helps us resolve ambiguity and uncertainty. It allows us to do vision very rapidly and automatically. It's hard to turn these off. Therefore, knowledge you can't just turn off top-down processing at whim, and so you can exploit that to do things. And I've just got two more fun examples of illusions that really show this. This one's called assumptions. We don't need the sound. I'll just leave the sound off.
How can you check best so portfolio so?
So what did he just use there? Familiar size, relative size, occlusion, etc., to build up a quick automatic perception of the world. And then he very carefully deconstructed that to show us what was really there. And one more fun example of this, you saw a bunch of these when you were playing with the illusions activity. You can create a world that distorts what seems people's sizes are, right? This child looks like they're really, really, really tall, and this child looks tiny. When you look through the window of this specially constructed room, what did they do? they created a room where one of these walls is actually very long. So she is like 12 feet away. This child is only 7 feet away. So, of course, she will be smaller in real life. But then for all of the distortions that would normally be present, that is, if you were to actually make the room 12 feet farther away, this whole window, right, would be smaller. So they made a bigger window, right? All these patterns on the floor would recede into the distance in a very particular way. So we counteract that by adjusting the pattern just in the right way so that when you see it, the two cancel each other out. And so when you look through this tiny little viewing window, you see exactly what you're supposed to see, carefully constructed to balance those two things. So our visual system is incredibly brilliant. It's super helpful. It helps us solve the world because the world doesn't really look like this, right? Unless you've got a really odd friend who designed their house like this for no apparent reason, you've never seen this situation naturally out in the world. Your visual system has learned that, and so it doesn't expect this. We have no practice in navigating spaces like this. So, of course, it gives our brain a bit of a guess and a bit of a bias that we can then exploit in various ways. One final bonus thing that I'm not going to test you on or anything, but I think is interesting, free to watch this on your own. Our book chapter talks about a phenomenon of someone who has brain damage for, I believe, area MT, or at least the areas involved with motion processing. And it's hard to figure out what the world would look like if you couldn't see motion, because the world is always changing. And so if you want to get a sense, you can watch this. It's like a dramatic recreation, very, very, very dramatic for whatever reason. I guess scientists aren't the best actors or something. And so it's trying to give a sense of what it was like when this woman would like watch someone pour tea into a cup. And I think it's kind of just a fun little bonus. Okay, so that takes us to the end of chapter 3. And so what I want to do is take a quick little break here, and we're going to come back and we're going to dive into chapter 4. I'll give you a little bit of a teaser about what we're going to do in our activity, and then we will go from there. So questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you for the comments that people threw into chat. That was really fun to go on those little discussions. So I will see you back here in about 5 minutes. Take care. See you soon. All right. So good to see you all again. Let me switch back to my face here. All right. So in the interest of making sure we get through everything, I don't want to leave you guys hanging like I did a little bit last week, although I'm sure people weren't too sad to have to skip one of the short answer questions on their end of week. I don't want to make that a habit. So let's keep going forward. Again, thank you for all your questions. That was really fun. Feel free to chime in again here. What we're going to do now is move into chapter 4. And so chapter 4 is going to pick up where we left off. Long story short, I just kind of gave you a bit of a teaser about that what pathway. And so I want to keep going down that same road to say, okay, great. So we've established that we can see and determine what things are by looking at them, but how do we actually do that? That's still a bit of a question, right? We had this very nice nuance about here's lines and edges and colors and contours, and we're building them. Okay, but now we've got this whole temporal lobe to work with, and it somehow solves the problem of what? How does it do that? And what does this enable us to do? So I'm going to argue, and what this chapter is going to argue, that we are very good at recognizing objects, in fact, a wide array of objects in a wide range of circumstances. So what is an object? Well, objects can be things like letters. In our case, we're actually going to spend a bit of time thinking about letters because we are, after all, experimental psychologists, and we want to design some carefully constructed stimuli that we can play with. Letters make a really good test bed for a lot of our theories. So we'll talk a bit about letters. Here's a fun font called Clothes, by the way, where all the letters are made out of clothes. I don't think there's any relationship between what type of clothes and what the letter is, but we are so darn good at detecting letters that when you see these like this, even though this is made out of, like, you know, what these things are. This is made out of a toga, but you can still infer that it is the letter D. And it's not just letters, it's all kinds of things. I have lots of apples in my slides for whatever reason. It's just a simple kind of object. Here are 3 apples seen from many different angles. Each apple is slightly different. Granny Smith, Honeycrisp, Cosmic, who knows? But you know that this is an apple from every one of these angles. You know that these are toy cars and a toy horse and a toy cow, which I know they're a little bit small, but that's what these are. And this is a coffee cup. And you see them from all these angles, and you pretty much know what it is right away. You do this for real world objects like cars. And maybe you can even figure out that this is not just a car, it's a sports car. And it's not just a sports car, it's a BMW. How do you do that? Takes a little bit of practice, but that's a pretty fine distinction that you can make. You might even do this for people, and in fact, you do this for people all the time. You recognize your friends. Does anyone here recognize who this person is by chance? Yeah, I made these slides like years ago, before this person was huger than huge, but now they have continued to gain popularity. This is Taylor Swift. Good job, Julia. Right, so this is a person that you've maybe never met in real life, but maybe you've seen enough pictures of her that you know who it is, even though she's looking down with sunglasses and so on. So we can recognize objects. There's a broad category of things in a lot of different situations, except when we can't. So here's a little aside about neuropsychology. Let's look at the case of DF. So we call people by their initials to protect their identity. So DF, their first and last names were started with D and F. When they eventually pass away, we can know what their full name was. So DF is one person who had brain damage and showed a pattern of visual agnosia. And I showed you this term earlier. This means that the person cannot name things that they see. So what does that mean? This seems odd. You're looking right at it. You can see it. What do you mean you can't name it? Well, we did some neuroimaging, and here's DF, and these little blue regions here are areas where in DF's brain there was damage. I believe he had a stroke. That's usually the case for these neuropsych patients today. And you'll notice where this is, right? So it's not actually fully in occipital. There's maybe a little bit of overlap, but this is that what pathway where there seems to be damage on both sides of the brain. So when we think about looking at the structure, what kind of functions are going to be disrupted, is going to be those identification of what we are seeing. And DF is not the only one. These are a handful of other participants who show the same behavioral agnosia, visual agnosia. Let me say something's going on. Let's look at your brain. Okay, this is the area that we tend to see these this brain damage pattern. Here's a little quote showing some examples. I'm going to show you pictures as well. This was a task given to DF where they said, here is a thing. I want you to look at this thing and draw it. And DF tried and got some of these features. Look, here's a line. It's going in a certain orientation. Great, here's another line. It's got a curve. There's even some intersections here. But this is a ladle, and this is certainly not. This is a far cry from a ladle. Something is missing, right? Some connection here between what they're seeing and what they're drawing is a little bit off. What about this? This is a recorder. Here's DF's rendition. Once again, you can see that some aspects of the stimulus are preserved and some are just kind of lost, and the organization of them seems, disjointed. Here's a clock, here's a pin. Again, not great. And this is also important to note that DF wasn't just a terrible artist who doesn't know how to draw, because what they later did, or separately had DF do, is draw items from memory. So not a visual task where you look at it and recreate it. This was you could close your eyes if you wanted, whatever. There's nothing in front of you. They said, draw a ladle, and this is what DF did. Draw a recorder, this is what DF did. Draw a clock and a pen, right? So they're clearly not the best artists in the world. Maybe if I had lots of time, I might do better, but that's not the point. The point here is that when they looked out at the world and there was a thing literally sitting right there in front of them, the process of determining what that thing was disrupted. They could not figure out what they were seeing. And this was profound. And this example here actually demonstrates our where versus what distinction very nicely. Here's one set of data that helps us know that these pathways are distinct. In this part of the experiment, DF was told to draw a line inside of a circle that was shown. So they would show this to DF and they would say, look at this, draw the line. And DF was terrible. So here are two control participants. They have normal vision. They were shown a horizontal line and they drew a horizontal line. They were shown this 60-degree line and they drew the 60-degree line, and so on. They were basically perfect. DF saw those exact same stimuli and produced all kinds of different responses. Like across different trials, you can do this a few times over and over again, and DF is all over the place. Cannot see what the stimulus is, and they cannot recreate it. But funnily and strangely enough, when they asked DF to do something, that is to use vision for movement, which you'll recall goes up towards parietal, up towards somatosensory and primary motor, different pathway, DF could do this task just fine. So they created a little aperture, a little hole, and the hole was kind of like blocked with little pieces of cardboard like this. And so there was just enough room where you could slip a playing card through between the two little pieces of cardboard, but you had to have it at the right angle. And DF was totally fine at doing this. When presented with a shape matching task, DF confused the triangle for the circle. They confused the trapezoid for the triangle, the X for the O, the key for the safety pin. Again, when asked to recreate visual forms, the recreations are quite off. In another situation, this is patient X, so not the same, but another person with a similar kind of damage was unable to read this stimulus as the word this. Instead, they kept reading it as 7415 and could not do anything else. Their ability to do some of these slightly more complex tasks of recognition that require, forming over these gaps was fully disrupted by this kind of brain damage. So we are largely good at this, and I've shown you lots of examples where we fill in the gaps and figure out what objects are, even when half of the information is missing. The way that we do that is through this distinct brain pathway for processing what we see. Okay, so we are very good at this in all kinds of situations. You recognize that this is an apple, even though it's an apple that's been eaten. You recognize this is a car, even though it's a car jumping off a cliff. It's not very typical. We do this with people. We know what actions they're taking, so we can coordinate. Someone's walking at you and they start leaning. You know what that means. You interpret it, you understand it, and you can even figure out what to do in response. We do this with people's facial expressions. We can label their emotions based on what their face is showing us. That is an object recognition task. The object is a human face, but you're very good. We do this with letters, with words, uppercase, lowercase, different fonts, different styles. We do this with shapes. We are unbelievably good at object recognition. And this is a thing that we want to understand. How in the world do we do this, right? And what does it give us is really the main goal for this chapter. That's our little teaser to kick things off. And I want to propose next a potential mechanism that has been put forward as a way to solve this problem. So this is a question that cognitive scientists want to answer. How do we do object recognition? Why are we so good in so many situations? And so what we're going to look at here is an early attempt to answer that question. And it's illustrative. That is, it's going to illustrate something here for us, something useful, ultimately by being wrong. So spoilers, this is not the right approach, but it will help us connect where we just were with chapter 3 to where we're going here in chapter 4. So how do we recognize things? Our test case is going to be something very simple like a letter. And so in what we call here our templates is a cognitive model. This is an invisible thing that we think might live inside of someone's head. And the idea here is that when you see objects in the world, whether they're letters or people or objects, cars, that you've kind of got an internal mental model of that thing. You've seen them a bunch, you've learned what it is, you've stored that in your brain. And so when you see new stuff, you just kind of say, which of these things does what I'm looking at right now match? The word template, by the way, comes from like early printing. You would kind of have these like metal letters that you could stamp into ink and stamp onto paper. And so they're always really consistent. A template does not change. And so it's a very rigid but accurate representation of something. So what would a template look like? Maybe somewhere in our brain, somewhere in the temporal lobe, let's say, we've got some kind of patches of neurons, and their job is to know what the letter A looks like. And so they're sitting there ready and waiting, and they're looking for things that look like this. And nearby, there's different ones that are looking for B and so on. So remember, templates are really distinct in the sense that they are very particular patterns that we are looking out on the world to find. So here is how we might apply a template to letter recognition. Imagine that you have a template for the letter A, and it looks something like this. If we want to get really specific, we could even argue that the way that this is formed, notice this little like grid of circles here, is we could say, okay, in our mind's eye, when I'm trying to figure out what letters I'm looking at, I've got this kind of grid space. And letters are basically formed by understanding which of these grids connect to which grids. Right? A very formal, rigid, kind of shared landscape. And so here's a representation of what the letter A might look like in such a space. Right? It's not a grid, right? They've got them kind of spread out in a non-linear way, but you can see these little dots here are connected through this line. And so the A is defined as whatever goes through those dots. And so if this is my template that lives in my mind and I see something in the world, I can basically just kind of slide those two things on top of each other and determine, do these match? Do these line up? And if they line up, excellent, right? Clearly these two line up. This must be an A. Done. Object recognized. And when I encounter different stimuli, like the letter L, right, it falls through different points. It doesn't overlap as nicely with the A. Can't be A. Let's keep scanning. Oh, it must be L. Done. Recognized. When I was asking you about those cognitive models where I said, how do we make the comparison step harder between encoding, comparison, and response? This is the kind of picture that you might have been imagining of like, okay, we'll check the A, we'll check the B, we'll check the L, and so on until we find a match. Cool. Pretty reasonable, pretty effective, decent. What's wrong with this? Well, it turns out that there are quite a few things wrong. Like, same picture, just moved up so I have more space. What happens if I, instead of encountering A right here dead in the middle of my vision, the A has been shifted a little bit downward? You know, I'm looking out at the world and I'm looking here, and there's something down here right in front of me, and it's not dead in the middle of my vision, but it's kind of down here. What is that thing? Do I have to move my eyes down to look at it and center it dead in my vision? Okay, maybe that certainly gets hard. People actually don't tend to do that. So nevertheless, they do seem to be able to recognize the letter A when it's over here or up here, kind of in the corner. We even recognize the letter A when A gets bigger, or when A gets rotated, when A gets smaller. So we're running into a few troubles. You know, the match is not perfect. You know, if I do this against that, like they don't quite line up, but there's some similarity. Heck, you know, in all these cases, maybe you know, if I compare this against all the other A's or all the B's and C's and so on, maybe A is still the best match, and like this is fine, right? It's not perfect. It's not perfectly in my vision, but hey, you know, I can do okay. A pretty good sense that it's A. But what happens when that template or the original input becomes so distorted that it's no longer recognizable? What if I just change the font and make the top curvy? What if I do a lowercase a? What if I show you one of those wild fonts that I showed you earlier with the A's being, oh, I guess it's in the other slide deck. Let me pull that up. What about all of these cases? Okay, maybe the A template lines up best with each of these, but maybe not. And it's starting to get a little bit tricky to think about how we might do this, especially for some of these weirder ones, like well, like those that I just showed. This one always looks like a butt to me. Maybe that's not very fair, but right. I don't know if this matches your template for an A very well. Okay, so maybe this is still fine. Like maybe what I just need are more templates, right? I've got this one. Sorry. I've got this one that's kind of dead centered and like this. Maybe I just have a smaller one and a bigger one, and I've got a bigger one that's rotated and a smaller one that's like also kind of rotated this way, and we've got a lowercase one that's small and big. And okay, maybe I just do it like this, right? Maybe that's fine. But what this is starting to look like is very, very complicated. Right? This is starting to look very complex and difficult to explain. My explanation for what is happening is starting to get kind of messy. If you imagine a lurking behaviorist who's sitting in the corner judging you every time you come up with a proposed mental explanation, oh boy, are they licking their lips, and they're so ready to jump on you because you are proposing a whole lot of stuff living inside someone's head right now. And it's starting to look pretty messy and hard to prove, hard to find evidence for, right? Like, what if I showed you a font that you've never seen and somehow it's an A? Like, how do you explain that? This is getting tough. And so this template approach has some nice features, and that the idea of there's similarity somehow between the thing that you're looking for and some knowledge is useful and is good. What we want to know about in some ways is, what does that knowledge look like? Is it the case that we go straight from the thing we encode to this fully formed representation? Is that how we've stored A with just this comparison has to happen directly? Or is there maybe something else in between that might give us a better sense of this? So Julia asks, is a visual template like the prior knowledge we have of what we are looking at? It is kind of like prior knowledge. It's learned through time, through experience. If you've never seen a car before, you're not going to have knowledge of what a car is. The idea here is that after you've encountered lots and lots of cars from different angles, different situations, whatever, you somehow kind of condense that or package that up into a single sense of a car. And then when you encounter new stuff, you kind of just say like, how similar is this new thing to my knowledge of car? And if it matches really well, you're good. But if it's a mismatch, then maybe it's a car, maybe it's something else. Right. So abstract concepts really push this to the limits, right? What does nothing look like? What does love look like? I don't know. It's hard. There's no single template maybe for that. We're going to talk about prototypes later on. which is going to have a lot of similarity here. And the idea of a prototype is that for some things that are relatively homogeneous or uniform, this kind of approach might be okay. That you could take those slight variations and kind of average out over all the irrelevant details and just kind of boil it down to its core and essential features. There are occasional cases where that is good, but for a lot of things, even for relatively simple things like letters, saying that we have to go straight from the visual world directly to this match at the whole letter of the entire level of the entire level, level of the entire letter can be problematic. There are cases like the numbers on your clock where the set of possibilities is small and the match is going to provide a pretty good, approximation every time. But even for numbers, there are fonts, right? Even for letters, there are fonts, and there's graffiti, and there's cool stylized advertisements and billboards and so many other things. We need an explanation of how we recognize letters and numbers and other things that doesn't require that we've got 8 billion different templates for the letter A in our head for every possible orientation and rotation and size and font and so on. Some more examples of the diversity of numbers. So the idea for a template is that you match the whole thing that you're currently seeing against the whole thing that you've got stored in your head. There's no in between. You just jump straight to that comparison. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, it must be something else. And that kind of works, but it kind of doesn't. So how do we do something better? How do we take what we just learned in chapter 3 about the way that our brain interacts with the world and maybe come up with a better answer to this problem? So I'm going to introduce you to an idea called a simple feature net. What is a simple feature net? This should look familiar. We just talked about the bottom-up pathway from the retina to LGN to V1 to V2 to V4, information flowing this direction, simple pieces being combined to make more complex pieces being combined to make even more complex pieces, and so on and so on. This is a framework. This is an architecture. This is an idea that we can tap into. If I want to know what the letter A is, or that I'm looking at the letter A currently, why don't I first detect some more basic stuff like, hey, there's a diagonal line over here. Oh no, hey, look, there's another diagonal line nearby and another one here and another one here. Why don't I just break this down into its pieces and recognize it in the exact same way that we just learned that our brain likes to do vision? We know that V1 is doing these things. We know that V2 is doing these things. This can be our intro to thinking about how we might come to recognize something that is as simple as a letter. Seems simple enough that we could just jump there, but actually that's not the case. How do we get there? By building it up from parts. And this has been a pursuit that people have tried to do. So we say, okay, here's some letters A, E, F, and H. Let's just think about all the different things that they have or don't have. They've all got some intersections. This line intersects with this line. Cool. This line intersects with that line. Great. They've got some symmetry. A is vertically symmetric, where it's the same on the left and the right. E is, horizontally symmetric. E is vertically symmetric. F is not symmetric. H has both. Right? There's even, we can think about lines they have. The A has a horizontal line. The E has horizontal lines. The F has horizontal lines. The H has horizontal lines. The A does not have a vertical line, but the others do. The A has some diagonal lines. Great. Why don't we just take this approach about thinking about lines, edges, corners, intersections, you name it, all the stuff that we know our very early version steps in the brain are doing? Well, maybe that gives us the answer for how we do recognition for letters. By the way, we're using letters because it's really easy to list out these features. Even then, for the simplest, like these are letters, and we've already got, straight lines that are doing different orientations. We've got curves and intersection, redundancy, and so on. This is why we're not jumping straight to how do we detect cars. That's a lot harder. let's start with this really simple case of letters, and let's see if we can build something that will help us understand how we do letter recognition using this bottom up, build out of the simple until we get to the right level kind of approach. And you can do this for all the letters, by the way. Intersections, closed curves, open curves, discontinuities where the line jumps like this, right? What are all the things that make letters? And if you do this, you'll start to find that there's kind of a distinct feature that makes letters what they are. This L, for example, has a horizontal discontinuity. It's got a vertical line. It's got a horizontal line. Maybe it's the only letter that has those things. So if I want to recognize L, maybe I just need to send my V1 off to detect some horizontal lines and vertical lines. And then I just have to stick those together one step into the future. And now I've got a very distinct, reliable, and accurate way to find the letter L in the world. And it is somewhat flexible to size, right? Horizontal just means horizontal. Could be long, could be short, could be rotated. Maybe that gives me some trouble, but maybe I can figure that out. This idea of not just immediately trying to recognize A as a whole thing. A is A because it has all these things, and if it doesn't have all those things, that's not A. Let's recognize A out of its features. And so this is the general idea. This is an old kind of textbook version of this. We're gonna see a couple representations of the same idea. But the logic here is that when you see something in the world, you can check. How many vertical lines does it have? Oh, it's got one. Okay. How many horizontal lines does it have? Oh, it's got two. How many oblique lines? One. How many right angles? Two. How many acute angles? Two. Right? We don't necessarily need to know exactly what these features are. I might have a theory as a cognitive psychologist that these might be the kinds of features that our brain is using, but we don't actually even need to say exactly what they are. We can just argue that there's at least some kind of intermediate step where rather than comparing the whole letter against some whole letter template, we figure out what letter it is by looking at simpler information first. And when you count these up, the number of right angles and acute angles and so on, you can kind of say, well, what letters in my knowledge have those things? And you can make a pretty good guess that what you're looking at is R. Maybe it's P, maybe it's D. You can essentially get a relative strength of the similarity here. And it doesn't require that the R is identical. The R could be ever so slightly different so long as these things are largely preserved, these features. I'm trying to think of the term here. It'll come back to me in a minute. There's a physics term that's very useful here. Maybe it would be useful. So this is the framing that our book has, and it's the exact same idea, just depicted differently. So we're going to look at this in a couple different pictures. The way that we want to think about the way that our brain recognizes complex stuff, words, sentences, and so on, is by breaking each of them down into something simpler. I recognize the word clock by first detecting that there's a C, an L, a O, a C, and a K. I recognize that there's a C by determining that there's this kind of curvy bit, and this kind of curvy bit, and this kind of curvy bit. I recognize that there's an L by this line, and so on. And so rather than having to have a template for the word clock that has to match perfectly on every single possible aspect of that stimulus, forget that template. I'm going to just think about simple features and combine them and combine them and combine them to put this all together. So this is our very bottom-up approach to understanding how we recognize anything, not just letters. We're going to actually look at this for objects too here in a moment. It's a slightly more complex case, but the logic is the exact same. Here is that same figure. I just laid it out with even more features, right? Same word, same features present. We can ask about whether or not each of these features is located on our stimulus. I can detect the L's, the C's, and the K's, and so on, simply as thinking about which of these more simple things are here. And I know that my brain can do this. I know that V1 can do this. I know that I can find these very simple things very reliably everywhere in my visual field. I don't need to think about how a template can handle an A in the middle versus an A down here near the bottom and small, because everywhere in my visual field, I'm checking for horizontals and verticals. I just need to be able to combine them somehow. And it's going to take a couple steps because I do need to be invariant. That's the word I was thinking of earlier. I do need to account for the fact that this might appear in different places, but I can do that if I think about how I use small pieces to build instead of jumping straight to recognizing the whole big thing. And we can do this for objects too. Here are two objects, everyday objects that you absolutely will recognize here in a moment, but I'm going to suggest that you probably don't currently recognize very well. If anyone has any guesses about what this object is or what the bottom one is, I'd love to see it. I can never come up with good, convincing guesses that aren't the right answer because I do know what they are because I've done this a bunch. This is the same, we're going to explore that same logic about building something complex out of something simpler, but now for actual 3D stuff, right? Letters are fun, letters are useful, but the world consists of more than letters. How do I figure out what is sitting on my desk or what's, in my closet or what's walking across the street in front of me? How do I interact with the 3D world using the same approach? Any guesses as to what these two things are? You see a mug. Top is a mug, smiley face. Good guesses. Actually, I always see the smiley face too here. Teacup, excellent. Okay, you might be completely unsure, like question marks. I don't know, right? Okay, so why is this hard? Let me tell you what's going on here. Some cognitive scientists sat down and they said, we have a theory for what the features of object recognition are. And so here are our features for letter recognition. It's pretty easy to think about, okay, lines and curves. That's what letters are made up of. I can lay all those out pretty easy. It's a little bit harder when we think about other kinds of three-dimensional shapes. So they said, look, we've got a theory of the features of objects, and we're going to test it. So remember, this is cog psych, right? We have we have to come up with testable theories. Their theory is, if we give you those features that we think are the ones that we use, that this is going to be very easy. But if we give you different features, then you're going to be terrible at recognizing objects. So if I give you the real features that our brain actually uses, then you'll be good. If I give you bad alternative features, then you're going to be bad at recognizing. So these are the bad features. These features are actually very unhelpful. But these features seem to be quite good. These are the bad features. These are the good features. And so now those of you who made guesses are starting to see that yes, in fact, the top is B and the bottom is a wine glass. I always love the smiley face example though, because right, these are like probably even the nostrils. We love faces. We're very apt to pick up on faces. And so I'm never surprised when people say face down for this one. But notice, these are incredibly easy. You pretty much know what it is right away. One of the important things to note here is that if you were to measure out the amount of line that is here, like if you measured the distance and how much is shown versus how much is hidden, it is actually the exact same in these two cases. It seems like or feels like we have more information here. It feels like, we've got all these lines. I know so much. They must have given me more information. They didn't give you more information, they gave you better information. And so what this is a way, this experiment is a way for us to test, hey, is my theory about features for objects correct? If I'm right, I give you those features, you're great at object recognition. If I'm right, I give you other bad features and you're terrible at object recognition. And I think this seems to be right. We did it here intuitively in the class and it seemed okay. Notice the emphasis here much more on these kind of intersections. Intersections between these kind of critical pieces where the different aspects of it come together, right? There's the goblet piece here, there's the stem, there's the base, right? We've got this opening here. I'm getting the clues as to those things by giving the features right where those interactions occur. And so here's the original, and there's some more fun ones here. Here's ones where those features are preserved, and you can immediately see coffee cup, wine glass, watering can, scissors, and like bar stool, it's like, yeah, you know exactly what it is. If I give you bad features over here on the right, you can kind of sense like, I have no idea what these things are. Especially the bar stool. Again, it's kind of hard to unsee it, but you know, if I just gave you this, you'd kind of be like, what in the world is that disaster of an object? What are all those lines? What is happening? Right? These are bad features. These are good features. And this is the way to test this theory. What they propose is that just like we build letters by finding those individual lines and curves and intersections, we do something similar with objects. What they propose here is something called a geon. This is like the lowest level of processing, where you've got a complex three-dimensional shape. You've got this like triangle-y, trapezoidy thing. You've got a box. You've got a cylinder. You've got kind of a cone and a curved cylinder. Here are 5 basic building blocks. These are not happening in V1. This is probably going to be more like V4, but they are more basic than the whole object itself. If I had to, I could say V1 is giving me edges and lines, V2 is giving me intersections, V3, etc. might be doing something. And by the time I get to V4, I've got something a little bit more complex. It's not the full object, but it's a piece of a full object. And maybe what I can do is I can combine these to make these. So what's a coffee cup according to this? It's a cylinder, geon number 3, plus the curvy little handle bit, geon number 5. What's a paint bucket? Funnily enough, the same 2 things. A cylinder with the curvy handle is just the orientation or where they fall next to each other is different. If this is a briefcase, this is a drawer. This is a coffee mug, this is a paint can. But notice that we're building up our recognition of what we see out of something simpler. And we know that those simpler things are still relatively complex. They're also built out of something simpler, and so on. So we are going bottom up here, but we're actually able to trace out decently well, just with behavior, what the basic building blocks are. And so features for edges, lines, etc., eventually work together to give us what they call these geons, which are these kind of rudimentary shapes. The way that those geons are put together, that is, is it on top, is it on the side, and so on. And then those come together to actually give us the object that we're looking at. So what this proposes is that when you see a briefcase out in the world, you don't have a direct path from your retina to a bunch of neurons that are waiting for a briefcase to show up. That pathway doesn't even make sense for it to be directly from there to there, because briefcases look so different from the lighting, from the color, from the orientation. Instead, if I want to think about how the vision comes into your eye and lets you recognize that there's a briefcase, it's going to go from retina to LGN to V1 to V2, etc., etc., etc. And when I finally look in temporal lobe, several steps down this processing chain, I might start to find little patches of neurons that correspond to this object that I'm looking at right now and tell me what it is. And this is where we're going to kind of pause here so I can show you what this actually works like. We're going to play with this a little bit. I'm going to introduce you to what you're going to do in your assignment for this class. So we're not going to do the assignment together. We're going to play with the tool that I've used to generate it. But I will pull up the assignment so we can look at it. So week 2, if we scroll down to object recognition puzzles, you will find a Word document just like before. And you can read this, and I will happily encourage you to do that as a refresher. But I'm also just going to walk you through what this looks like for us here. So just pull these over. So I'm going to start you off by showing you our little simulation. What we are going to be doing is simulating kind of just the V1 level of our brain when it encounters information coming from the retina and LGN. I'm not doing any edge enhancement or anything fun. We're really just going straight from the outside world straight to our V1. And we're going to see how much information is actually contained in V1 that might tell us about what we're looking at. So this is the way that this is set up. This is the outside world. You are a computer. You're a person who's got a very limited scope on the world, right? It's a little simulation I made. I can't make a color three-dimensional image representing the entire world. We're going to work with a very, very, very simple little situation here. So this is the letter A, at least my best attempt at drawing the letter A. Okay. Maybe that's better. Let's do that. Okay, so this is the letter A. I want you to imagine that you're looking at a piece of paper, you found this little blob of something, and you want to figure out what it is. You're staring at the letter A. What this simulation is going to let us do is play around with this idea that we might have feature detectors. So I've got a bunch of possibilities here. I'm only using 2 at the moment. So we just talked about the fact that we might recognize letters by detecting if there's horizontal lines or vertical lines. That's exactly what these 2 little graphics are representing here for us. This here is a vertical line detector. The red colors mean it is looking for pixels that are stacked one on top of each other. That's why they're red. Good, it actually likes those. And a red is kind of sometimes interpreted as bad. But red here means I like to see pixels that are stacked on top of each other. And the blue around the outside says that this little feature detector is unhappy when it finds any pixels in that blue region. Similarly, over here on the right, we've got a horizontal line detector. Again, this feature detector wants to see where are there pixels that are next to each other, and I don't really love if there's pixels stacked on top of each other. And we talked about massive parallel processing in the visual field. What is essentially going to happen is that each of these little feature detectors is going to be used to scan this image. And so it's going to ask up here in the top left corner, hey, are there pixels stacked in a row like this? And currently with my letter A, there are not. There's in fact nothing up here. So it's going to scan over here and say, there's nothing there. Sorry, there is no vertical line up here in the top left corner. And in parallel, it's going to check over here and ask the exact same question. And over here, it's going to ask the same question, and so on and so on. This little visual world, this very simple visual brain here is going to check every one of these little pixels and say, hey, is there a vertical line or not? And so as you look at this, you can do this for yourself and you can guess what it's going to see, right? It's not going to find anything over here, but when it is checking this location, it will say, hey, yeah, there is a bit of a vertical line here. And if it checks this location, it's going to say, yeah, hey, there is a bit of a vertical line here, and so on and so on and so on. So there are places in this image where the vertical line detector is going to check and say, I found my feature. I found a vertical line. I'm very happy. Good. And there are going to be other locations in the image where the horizontal line detector is going to say, hey, I checked everywhere and I found a horizontal line right here. So think for a moment, imagine in your mind's eye, perhaps make some guesses about where you think these horizontal lines might be found and where these vertical lines might be found. Kind of imagine, guess what it might look like. And I'll bring over the answer that this system actually sees. And I will put it nearby. So this is the result of those questions. This box right here represents what happens when this visual system has checked every single square and said, is there a vertical line here or not? And all these red regions indicate places where it's found some evidence that there's a vertical line. So obviously there's a big vertical line right here, right? There's 5 pixels in a row that are vertical. What do we see in the output? Our vertical line detector succeeded. It found a bunch of vertical pixels there. So it's saying, hey, you asked me to look everywhere for vertical lines. I found them. And there's a bunch right here. And it also found a bunch over here. Not surprising. There are actual big vertical lines here in what it is looking at. And the horizontal detector did its job too. And it found this nice, pretty vertical line or horizontal line going straight across the middle. Great. So that's the basics here. You'll also notice that there are places where there's kind of lighter colors. This dot that lives on its own isn't completely different from a vertical line. It's similar, but not quite as strong. So the intensity of these colors, the really deep red, means that the system says that, yeah, there's definitely a vertical line here, whereas the lighter pinkish reds suggest that like there's something that is somewhat vertical-ish in that area. Right? There's something that's kind of horizontal-ish in that area. And so there's some lighter matches and there's some really strong matches. So I want you to focus on the strong ones. So this is a way for us to do visual feature detection on any arbitrary image we want, and we can see how our system responds. I'll make an even clearer example of our A. This is what I started with before I changed it. Two big horizontal line or vertical lines, two big horizontal lines. We've got a big clue about what we're looking at. So we can use this to test various ideas. In fact, I want to test the idea of a template by playing around a little bit with some alternative feature detectors that might exist. Build. I'm going to build a template. Oops, I spelled this wrong. I'm going to build a slightly more complicated kind of detector. And this detector is going to look for the entire letter A and only the letter A in the exact shape that we actually have it. And so it's going to scan every part of the visual field and say, hey, is there an A that looks just like this? This takes a minute to build because I have to click a bunch of little squares to do it. So here's a new different kind of detector, right, over here on the right. This is an A detector. It detects this shape and only this shape, and anything that matches this shape, it is going to be very happy with and say, I found it. But anything that doesn't perfectly match this shape, it's going to say, I don't know, I don't see that thing at all. So this is something like a template that you could imagine living in your mind. Right? If you imagined, if it really was the case that we only had this very high level abstraction, and the very first step of recognizing what I'm looking at was to immediately compare this input to this template. In this case, it's going to be great. They're identical. No problem. Beautiful, perfect match, wonderful. And we can actually see that as the output here. It's fine. Got this really big red dot right in the middle that says, hey, I found that thing. It's right dead smack in the middle of your vision. I found the A. Good. But what if my A changes in any way, shape, or form from the template, right? It's going to have a little bit more trouble recognizing this thing, and it's going to be a little bit less clear. So this is a little thing that we can play with. We can explore some more options. I've got some other ideas of stimuli to show you. And we can explore some things like some of the basic feature detectors we talked about before. Before we do that, I want to show you the activity you're going to do. So in this Word document, I basically give you the exact same setup. Everything that I label as A is that input. It's what the system is actually seeing. And basically all of the puzzles I present to you, I'm going to show you the features. I'm going to show you these features, and I'm going to show you what they find when they look at the world. So features on the left, what they find when they scan the world, and I want you to make an informed guess about what the stimulus is, what the raw input is to the system. And I made some very simple examples where the answer is often like a capital letter. So in the very first example, I tell you about a visual world where there's some small dots and a giant blob. And then I show you that we have feature detectors that look for just a small dot. This is one of those center surround kind of responses that we talked about in chapter 3, where this is going to be very happy when it scans the image and it finds a dot that is lit up but has nothing around it. So the red in the middle means I'm looking for dots, but only dots that have no dots immediately around them. And so the system will scan this across every pixel of the input, and it's going to tell us where it finds it, and it's going to tell us where it doesn't. And this is what it discovers. It scanned that whole input where there were dots and a giant blob, and it found a perfect match against the dots in each of these 4 locations, and it found nothing where that blob was because the blob is not what it's looking for. The detector that we have is looking for 1 pixel with nothing around it, and there are 4 perfect examples of that in the original. 4 perfect examples of that in the original. There's this big blob up here that does not match that pattern at all. So when we ask the system, did you find any dots? The answer is yes, I found 4 dots right here. So in the remaining examples, I ask you to think about what input would have generated what we see. So in puzzle number 1, same dot detector, 1 dot with nothing around. But let's add another kind of detector. It's a blob detector. Could be a center surround, but for a much larger space. The receptive field of this neuron is much larger. It's pooling over a bigger part of the retina. It is looking for a bunch of place where there's input and surrounding there's nothing. So my question for you for this very first example is, if we feed this input in, what is that second feature going to find? Is it going to find these little dots? Is it going to find this blob? Is it going to find something totally different? When this visual system scans, it's going to look for dots, it's going to look for blobs. I want you to tell me what it's going to find. And then in the rest, I give you some horizontal and vertical line detectors, and I show you what the output is when this system looked out at the world. And my question for you is, what stimulus, when processed by this V1 feature and this V1 feature, would have produced this output pattern? So this is not V1 to V2 to V4 and so on. This is literally just that first step. And I want you to play the role of all those later layers. I want you to combine what's happening here in V1 and say, gosh, well, maybe I've got some corners or some edges or a texture. Okay, well, what shape would make this? And so you get to play the role of V2 and onward and tell me what you think this system is looking at. And in almost every case, it's a letter, and in some cases, it's like a simple shape. The final one here has a couple other feature detectors. We've got a horizontal detector, a vertical detector, and some diagonal detectors. And here's all those outputs, and you get to figure out what must be out there if this is how the system is responding. So this is a great chance to ask some questions about that. Right, it's not the most intuitive thing in the world. That's why I wanted to play with it a little bit together, so you can get some practice and experience playing with this to see how it might work. So I can build some really very picky detectors here while we're talking, and we can just play with different inputs to see how they make this system respond. And in fact, I'm gonna reset this whole thing. I'm keeping an eye on chat while I'm making my detectors here. So our basic visual system is going to look out in the world. V1 is going to be looking for lines of different orientations. Here's a vertical and a horizontal. I'll do a diagonal also. Diagonal going the other way. And let's make our little on center off surround. And let's make a bigger on center with a larger off surround as well. And then we can play with different inputs. Like what happens if I write the lowercase letter I? Excuse me. I think I need to add more of these. Yeah. You need to really make these picky. So they prefer exactly this stimulus and nothing else. Just more clicks to do it. Okay. I don't understand why I saw 3 red dots from the 1 dot. Yeah, I'm not sure when that moment was. Oh, 3 red dots from the 1 dot. So depending on how picky you make these, I'm really turning off the I'm really making the surround around these features very strong. It just takes a lot of clicks to do this, which is why I didn't do it on the first pass. So now I'm making it so that these look for very, very, very specific things, and only those things will make these features activate. The reason that you saw, great question, Charlotte. It is in a program called MATLAB, and I've wanted, in a perfect world, I would be able to provide it. I would love to talk with you. Send me an email and we can talk about it. It's not a very easily accessible program, is the short answer. But yes, I would love to be able to distribute this. What are we supposed to see when we add more rows of red dots in question 1? So in question 1 of the document, I'm giving you 2 feature detectors now. So you have one detector that's looking for a tiny dot with nothing around it, and you're looking for a bigger dot with nothing around it. So the system is going to check for both of those things. And this is what it's looking at. There are some little dots. There is one big dot. I want you to tell me what the output of that second big dot detector is going to be. And just use words. You could draw a picture. You can use words. You can just describe. I think it's going to be active in this location of where it's looking. It's going to find a match over here. It's not going to find a match over here. So I'm asking you to see what happens when the system looks at this, or looks at this picture for this pattern right here. It's like a pattern finder, and this is the pattern and this is the input. Right, so yeah, I feel like it won't see much, totally. A lot of this, it's going to find absolutely nothing, right? Is there anything up here in this top left corner? Absolutely not. So when it checks up there, it's going to find nothing, and it's going to say, there's nothing in the top left. And then it's going to check, it's going to check every single pixel of this. So when it's checking over here, it's probably also not going to find anything. The question is, what does it find when it is checking some of these other regions where there's something, right? There's a dot here, there's a dot here, there's a blob. In those cases, is this system going to say, I found a match, or is it going to say, I did not find a match? Keep making my things here. Good questions. Keep them coming. That's why it takes so long to click these. All right, we're almost there. Really want to make this a very clear, on center, off surround. This guy definitely doesn't want any friends around. Okay, so here's our input, lowercase letter I. We're going to check all these features simultaneously, and we're going to find, hey, there's a lot of vertical lines. Hey, there's some horizontal lines. It's also a little bit finicky, which is why I'm taking my time here. Okay. The normalization is a little bit off on this, but the idea is that we can scan for all these and look. So I tend to tweak it a bit to make your assignment make sense, but I promise it does. The live demo, a little bit less reliable. Okay. All right, so when we scan this, we tend to find a vertical line. We kind of find a bit of a horizontal line, but mostly we find a dot. There's a little bit of this diagonalness because of the way that this interacts with the way that I made this diagonal detector. So when you pull together all of these, we say, okay, we've got some places where we think there's vertical. We've got some places where we think there's a dot. We've got some places where we think there is a diagonal. What is the thing that makes this happen? Which of those are strong? Which of those are weak? How do we combine this all together? That's the idea of what this system is doing. So I created really clear-cut examples for you. The exact way that these features are constructed matters a lot. So that's why it's a little bit weird here in this version. But what we're trying to do is simulate what your brain sees in V1 when we present really simple objects to it. It's going to find patterns that match or don't match in various places. So Ashley is saying, for the second one, would it be a capital letter H or a capital letter A? You're definitely on the right track. You're going in the right direction. What would an A have that an H wouldn't, and vice versa? And then look for that feature, right? So the A is, as I kind of drew it out here, has that crossbar, whereas the H is not going to have that. So the thing that's probably going to set those apart is whether or not it's finding that horizontal line up top or only in the middle. Does the code care if the cells in the first question are 3 by 3 and B2 is 5 by 5? So that's the determining factor. So great question, Charlotte. Yes. Does the code care if this is 5 by 5? Notice that this goes across 5 different cells, but in the input image it's 3. This is a good chance to remind you what these colors mean. The red means that it is looking for that pixel to be filled in black. So red on top of black is good. The blue means that we really, really, really don't want that pixel to be turned on black. So in an ideal world, what this feature B2 is finding is a 3 by 3 grid of black dots with at least a 1 by 1 border around the outside that does not have black dots. That's why it's red where it's looking for the pixels and blue where it's really looking for not pixels to be filled in. So I'll give you the answer here. Essentially, what this is looking for is exactly the shape right here. It is looking for a 3 by 3 grid of pixels that are filled in that also does not have anything on the outside. Lo and behold, this is exactly what we have up in this corner. We have a 3 by 3 grid of pixels that are filled in and nothing around them. So this will be a perfect match for what B2 is looking for. And so when B2 scans this, it's not going to find that match anywhere else except in this exact location. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you for that question. Yep. Color here is to denote whether the system wants a pixel to be present or not. So red means I am looking for places where there is a pixel here in the red spots, and I'm looking for places where there is not a pixel in the blue spots. And I'll just say that this is outlined in the top in the instructions, so you can read that again. Red colors indicate something that this detector is looking for. Blue color indicates something that this detector is not looking for. So this detector, the first one in 1B, the detector is looking for a single dot, that's why it's red, with nothing around it, specifically with nothing around it. So this is why we would consider it an on-center, off-surround, is that yes, middle, filled in, but also critically, we don't want to have anything else around it. If you didn't have this off-surround, this system would happily find a whole bunch of dots here up in the corner because there are, in fact, dots. They're next to each other. If this was not a on center off surround, it would say, oh, here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot. But that matters, right? In our visual system, we know that certain neurons will only fire if there's light and surrounded by dark, which is what we're trying to simulate here. Great questions. I do want you to give, I would prefer if you give me a little bit of something. I did just phrase it as tell me what letter it is. Talk me through it a little bit, ideally, so I have a sense. Yeah, just give me a bit of an explanation as to what your thought process was. Like, okay, I saw some lines, they intersected. That would be great. Yep, thanks for that question. What other questions do we have on this? I know this is a little bit outside of the box, right, where I'm asking you to put yourself into the shoes of V1, which is an interesting philosophical point about how your brain does this all the time, and yet also your brain is having a hard time understanding how to do this. Those are different kinds of brain activity. Metaphysical point there. Anyway, happy to clarify. And I try to make these like very clear cut, very straightforward. I think if you're asking yourself, like if there's 7 different options that you're considering that might be a good answer, maybe back up a little bit and reevaluate. This is the one, by the way, number 4. It's not a letter. It is just like a simple geometric shape that you've encountered before. Are we going to get to the last 2 PowerPoints? Yes. Yes, we are. Let's talk about faces, and then I think I'm going to have to do the thing where I upload the video of the last one for us. Thank you. I got a little distracted there. All right. So I've mentioned that faces are important and useful. Just like we can recognize letters and we can recognize objects, we are very good at recognizing faces. We know that because we found parts of the brain that seem to respond almost exclusively to faces and very few other things. We've also found that there are people who can recognize all kinds of visual objects except faces. They have a specific pattern of brain damage where they can do everything else except recognize a face. So this is another one of these cool neuropsych studies. There are even people that are unbelievably good at faces above and beyond. So this seems to be a distinct skill. I encourage you to watch this video. This is a man who has prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize faces. He will stare right at this reporter and he can tell her that she has blonde hair, that she has certain skin tone, complexion, etc. But if he saw her in this interview where they probably talked for hours, if he saw her the very next day, he would not recognize her as the same person. Sorry for this. Oh man. Double whammy. All right. Most strikingly, in talking to the interviewer herself, they do a little demo where they try to show her what it's like to experience face blindness. They show her a picture of her own daughter, and in this simulation, she does not recognize her own daughter, nor these other 90s celebrities. So this is a phenomenon that's very distinct. People cannot recognize faces. It's amazing. It's hard to imagine, but again, check this out to get a sense. So we've learned about some special ways that we process faces, what makes them so special, by using some experimental manipulations. And this one is really simple. If you ask people to study a bunch of different faces, and they study them right side up, and then you later test them on those faces, and you ask, was this a face that we showed you before, or is this new? You can either test them with those faces right side up again, or you can flip those faces upside down. And of course, flipping them upside down is going to hurt performance. But for faces, the degree to which flipping it upside down hurts performance is much larger than for other categories. So here is the number of errors you make when we don't flip them upside down. It's like 1. People are pretty good. Flip them upside down, people tend to make 4 to 5 errors. If you do the same experiment, but with houses, where you study a list of houses and then you test their memory again for upside down and right side up houses, people are, again, slightly worse, but not so bad. Upright versus inverted houses, still a bit of a performance decrease, but not as big. So something about the way that we process faces incorporates the orientation. There's something special about processing faces that are right side up that gets disturbed or broken up when we flip them upside down. Here's another example. This is one of the illusions that was on that website called the Thatcher illusion. This is famous British Prime Minister from the 60s, 70s or so. When you look at this, you think these are just two faces that are upside down. Why are you showing me this? There's maybe some weird stuff going on over here, but these just look like upside down faces. And when I flip this one back right side up, you say, yep, that's a person, cool, nothing so special. But when I flip the one on the left upside down, you'll notice suddenly something you did not notice when it was upside down, which is that her face is freakishly distorted. Turning the face upside down, you don't notice this. This seems fine. This seems normal. When you perceive faces upside down, something seems to get disrupted or lost. But as soon as I flip it right side up, all of your normal face processing stuff comes into bear and you say, oh my gosh, something terrifying has been done here. And what they actually did is they flipped the mouth and the eyes upside down. And this is an old study. They literally cut them out of the piece of paper and taped them back upside down to make this. And as I said, we have specialized areas of our brain that seem to do this. If we look on the underside of our temporal lobe in the what pathway, this yellow region is what's called the fusiform gyrus. And when you show people pictures of faces, in an MRI study, this area lights up like crazy. Blood flow is really high here. That's actually what's being plotted here. When you go from looking at a house to looking at a face, you get this big spike in blood in the fusiform gyrus. And conversely, there's another region over here called the parahippocampal gyrus that seems to really light up when we see pictures of places. So if you're looking at a face and then we change it so you look at the house, this PPA activation ramps up too. So this is telling us a little bit about object recognition. Here's that what pathway coming from occipital, the bottom part of the temporal lobe. There are neurons who seem to respond selectively to distinct categories, all the way up to the level of faces and face-like objects versus houses versus some other things. But it isn't just faces. We can construct artificial stimuli like these, which are called greebles, which contain many of the same features of faces. They're symmetric. They have lots of these distinct individual features. And when you present greebles to people in a scanner, you'll find that same fusiform gyrus area lighting up. You can also flip them upside down. So here are the activation in the brain for greebles that are presented upright versus those that are presented inverted. The FFA really likes the upright versions, doesn't love the upside down ones. And you get the exact same for faces. So greebles are similar to faces. And this tells us that the FFA doesn't love faces per se, it loves face-like objects. Other kinds of experiments have shown us that faces are processed in a unique way. This is what's called the, the composite face effect, where if you stick two faces together, it's hard to recognize either one. This is one person, this is a different person. But as soon as you move them apart, you can quickly perhaps note that this is Hugh Jackman, and the bottom face is, show you, Justin Timberlake. So something about the way that our brain processes faces likes to combine all of that information together, and it's very difficult to stop it from doing that. It really loves to look at the whole image and put all those pieces together. The brain also, besides MRI, shows distinct processing for faces. In an EEG study, if you show a face, you will always show this negative peak about 170 milliseconds after the face appears, often on the sides of the brain, right down where that temporal lobe is. Fusiform gyrus is likely responsible for this. There's some other effects here that are quite cool too, but we can note this in EEG studies as well. So there are distinct brain processing regions that help us see faces among all the things that we could possibly see. We even see illusory faces like this devilish face appearing in the clouds after 9/11. It wasn't a real devil face, but our brain liked to see a face there. I can skip this too, that's fine. What this really starts to tell us is that this level of processing in the temporal lobe is extremely good at the higher level recognition of objects. From V1 all the way up to anterior temporal, we get more and more specific with what is making the brain fire. So if we're looking way down here, we are talking about recognition perhaps for individual people. Here we might be looking at just faces more broadly, and these are those simpler pieces that lead up to this prior. So as we move this direction, we get more specific, more complex, more precise things that will make the brain fire. And when we were thinking about things here, it's much more broad and generic. There's a really cool finding from about 2005 where a researcher thought that they had found a neuron that responded only to Halle Berry, the actress. And it responded to her name written out in text, as well as her when she was in character, as well as when she was drawn out in line drawings and actual pictures of the real woman. And they suggested that maybe this part of our brain had single neurons that responded to single people. Another this is aligned with previous research making a similar argument about the location of grandmother cells that respond to just your grandmother. This has some accuracy, but what we've largely found, I'll skip over this, is not necessarily that a single neuron responds to a single person, but rather that there's a very sparse coding. In other words, there's a small number of things that that neuron is going to fire for, and there's a small number of neurons that are going to fire in response to certain stimuli. It's not one-to-one, but it is a small number of neurons and a small number of stimuli, which is to say that the brain does get more and more refined and precise and specific about what it's firing for. This is how we eventually get to the point that we can have knowledge of a single person who's different from a single person who's different from a single other person deep into our temporal lobe. And so that's the crash course. I know that that was fast. I'm going to upload a video that's a longer form version of this, as well as a video for the expanding the feature net area. I love doing these in-class activities. They're seeming to take a bit more time than I intend. So that's where we're going to wrap up. This has been really, hopefully interesting, starting with vision, learning about all what we know. If you get stuck on either of those activities, I'd love to help and get a head start on some stuff. Reach out if you're feeling a bit lost or stuck. And have a wonderful rest of your week and a great weekend. Thank you so much. Thanks for sticking around. Take care. See y'all next week. Thank you so much. Thanks for all your comments.